You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When is the last time you made s'mores? Crunchy, gooey, and with everyone's favorite, Hershey's milk chocolate. Whether you're making new memories with your friends beside a campfire, inviting neighbors over for a casual cookout, or cooking s'mores in the oven with your family on a rainy day, enjoy some more of each other with Hershey's S'mores. Find Hershey's milk chocolate bars at your favorite retailer. Time to s'more some more.
Hey everybody, it's Katie here. I hope y'all are enjoying our Wars of the Roses week. I know I'm enjoying revisiting all of it. And what we have for you today is an episode from Patreon. Over on Patreon, I have a show called Katie's Corner where I just go on random rabbit holes. And today we are bringing you one about Jane Shore. So if you're not a Patreon supporter, this is the kind of content you might find over there. All right, well, I hope you all enjoy. Cheers, bitches. Oh, and if you're new to Queen's Podcast, we curse a lot on this show. So if that's not your thing, this is not the show for you. All right, cheers. Hey, Queens, and welcome back to another week of Katie's Corner. Today, I want to talk about Jane Shore and her famous Walk of Shame. Possibly the most famous Walk of Shame ever. That is, until George R.R. Martin put it in Game of Thrones. Jane's Walk of Shame and Cersei's Walk of Shame, you know, with the lady ringing the bell. Shame! Shame! Yeah, I don't think I have to tell you nerds that Cersei Lannister Walk of Shame is based on Jane Shore. I'm sure most of you already know that, but in case you didn't, that scene from Game of Thrones was inspired about what we're going to talk about today. And if you don't watch Game of Thrones, never mind, but I think you'll still find this story interesting. This is the story of the famous mistress of Edward IV, Jane Shore. So let's get into her life. Just like everybody else that I've talked about in this series, you know, a lot of her childhood, when she was born, all that good stuff is not really recorded. So a lot of this is going to be conjecture, but I think you guys are used to this by now. First of all, her name wasn't even Jane. Her name was Elizabeth. She was named Elizabeth Lambert at birth. And at first, I just kind of assumed Elizabeth because she was named after Queen Elizabeth Woodville, which was, you know, the common thing. You name your daughters after the queen. But no, she was like in her teens possibly when Edward became king and married Elizabeth Woodville. I just assumed before knowing anything about this story that she was going to be like half Edward's age, because that's usually the thing with mistresses. I think Edward IV was only like 2 or 3 years older than her, which I guess is refreshing. I don't know. But just to avoid any confusion, I'm going to call her Jane throughout this because that's what she's known as in history. And so we don't get her confused with Elizabeth Woodville, who I will bring up a couple of times. So Jane is probably born in 1445 in London. Her family is very much part of like the working class, but like the upper working class. They were fairly wealthy, you know, compared to other people in the class of people that had jobs. They weren't dukes or anything like that, but her father was a really well-to-do merchant, and her mother's family were also well-to-do merchants in like the grocery store business or whatever the equivalent would have been back then. So she is born into a comfortable family. I can't really figure out the details of her education. Everything I've read says it was good. I don't know what that means for the middle class. But I have to assume that means that she could read, knew basic math. Maybe she spoke a little bit en français because, you know, she would have talked to like merchants coming in from France or wherever to sell their goods to her father's store. She would have expected to know how to like run the store and stuff like that. You know, I'm thinking that it was a practical education based around, okay, one day you're going to marry a man who's also going to be a wealthy merchant, and you're going to be expected to be able to like help with the finances, help with the store here and there in between having babies. So she wasn't educated like some of the contemporaries, like, fucking Catherine of Aragon or anything like that. But she also wasn't completely uneducated. She was really quick. Everything that it says about her says she was like really witty and really like quick on her feet. So it seems like on top of being educated, she was also just kind of like curious minded. In the store, at her father's store, like the upper class, the women of the nobility would come in there to purchase stuff for like their gowns. Like, so I guess he must have sold fancy fucking fabrics and stuff. She would see these ladies come in and she would try to mimic the way that they spoke, the way that they acted, see like what they were buying and want to try to like mimic it for her own styles. So on top of being smart and quick and just all around fun to hang out with, she was also really pretty. From a young age, she was really popular with the dudes. Thomas More wrote something along the lines of, she was pretty, but she wasn't like outstandingly pretty because she was short. So men liked her more for her personality, which, what the fuck does Thomas More have against short girls? And also, I've never heard that really being a problem with dudes before. Like when the Olsen twins were like all the rage, no one was like, yeah, but they're 5'1", you know? I don't fucking know. I read on Wikipedia that William Hastings was in love with her at a young age. But because Wikipedia is Wikipedia, always look for second sources before using that as a relied upon story. And it's just muddy. I don't know. But it seems like William Hastings, who was King Edward IV's BFF and like drinking buddy and just like ride or die dude, came in, saw her when she was young and started like hitting on her and made it very obvious that he was into her. And he was married to this chick named Catherine Neville. Yeah, that last name, Neville. She is the sister of the Kingmaker, Warwick. And so, like, Jane's dad is just like, oh, I don't really like married dudes coming in here and talking to her. So I need to get her hitched up. We need to get her married. So, because, you know, it would be a scandal if she took up with a guy that's like a powerful dude that's married to a pretty powerful woman. That's when we're introduced to a guy named William Shore. William Shore was a really well-to-do goldsmith and banker. This would have been a really good match for Jane, because it's kind of like a lateral move from one really wealthy working class family to another. And also he's a goldsmith, so he can have like lots of jewelry or something. And while he was 15 years older than her, there really wasn't seemed as such a huge age gap back then. And we've definitely seen queens married to like much older dudes than just 15 years. And also, on top of him not being like a decrepit old man, by all accounts, there's not a whole lot of information out there on William Shore, but in everything, he is described as handsome and nice, and he was like popular in London, so he was probably like handsome and charismatic and rich. So, I mean, on paper, Jane's dad really thought he was doing his daughter a solid in locking down this pretty eligible bachelor. I cannot figure out when she married William or how long they were married, but we know that she never fell in love with him. She just never warmed up to him. I don't know if he felt the same way. I don't know if it was just like an unhappy marriage and there was lots of fighting. It doesn't seem like there was like a whole lot of infidelity on his part. It doesn't seem like he was abusive to her or anything. It just never happened for them. And in 1476, they got an annulment. If the birth date is right, then she was about 31. So I really, really wish I had more information on this timeline, because they may have been married like a long time. Like, the average age for somebody in the working class for a woman to get married was in between like 16 and 20. So they may have been married for like almost 15 years or something. I just really wish that I knew. That's a rabbit hole that I went down and just found a whole bunch of nothing about. If I am missing something and y'all know, please educate me, because I was so confused about that. So let's talk about this annulment, because I feel like you don't read a whole lot about people in the lower classes getting annulments that are issued by the fucking Pope. Like, the Pope said, yeah. And I'm like, why is the Pope getting involved in the breaking up of this marriage of a couple of merchants in London? It was also strange because wives very rarely were the ones to instigate annulments unless it was like in a case of abuse. Like, he is just beating the ever-loving shit out of me. Like, I'm scared for my life. That is really the only time you saw women petitioning for annulments, and that just wasn't the case here, because it was a big shame on you to be like, oh, you can't make this marriage work, what's wrong with you? Because misogyny. Usually when annulment cases came up, it was the man either being like, she's barren, she can't have kids, or if a woman had like stepped out on the marriage. It really women didn't really file for annulments because the guy stepped out on the marriage, because it was just so much more common. Also, annulments were fucking expensive. And yeah, they were doing okay. But it's like, ooh, she must have been really, really unhappy. In the petition, because she had to have a reason, she accused William of being impotent. And she was like, I'm just so desperate to be a mother, and my clock is ticking over here. He can't get it up. You gotta let me out of this. And that is so humiliating for William. I don't know anything about the rest of this guy's life. I'm poised to think it sounds like he was a nice guy that just, they didn't have any babies for whatever reason. But, fucking harsh. Poor guy. All right, so it's like, how is this merchant's wife in London affording an annulment that's going all the way to the attention of the Pope? Oh, because she's probably already fucking the king.
Hello, listeners. This is Anne Bogle, author, blogger, and creator of the podcast, What Should I Read Next? Since 2016, I've been helping readers bring more joy and delight into their reading lives. Every week, I talk all things books and reading with a guest and guide them in discovering their next read. They share 3 books they love, 1 book they don't, and what they've been reading lately. And I recommend 3 titles they may enjoy reading next. Guests have said our conversations are like therapy, troubleshooting issues that have plagued their reading lives for years, and possibly the rest of their lives as well. And of course, recommending books that meet the moment, whether they are looking for deep introspection to spur or encourage a life change, or a frothy page-turner to help them escape the stresses of work, school, everything. You'll learn something about yourself as a reader, and you'll definitely walk away confident to choose your next read with a whole list of new books and authors to try. So join us each Tuesday for What Should I Read Next? Subscribe now wherever you're listening to this podcast, and visit our website, whatshouldireadnextpodcast.com, to find out more.
Hi, I'm Neil.
And I'm Lauren.
And we're both moderately successful trivia podcasters.
You co-host Triviality, and I co-host Misinformation, a trivia podcast.
But we decided to get together to make our own podcast, Curated by Chance.
Because we both love to talk about the topics we know a lot about. I'm an art curator who also teaches art history to engineers.
And I'm a filmmaker and author who loves movies. But Lauren hasn't seen a lot of movies. You're telling me you seriously have never seen North by Northwest or The Devil Wears Prada?
What's that? And Neil doesn't know a thing about art. So every week we use 3 random prompts from our trusty algorithm Chance, designed by a NASA scientist.
The great curator.
That will help us come up with weekly topics to tell each other about, whether it be an artwork, a movie, a book,
a pop culture event, a Broadway show, or even a TV show for dads, like Bosch.
So listen in every week to join us, 2 good friends with generalized anxiety disorder who aren't going to apologize for excitedly talking about the things we love for the first time in our lives. They made a TV show about Hieronymus Bosch?
Not the one you're thinking of.
Yep. Her annulment is granted in 1476, and pretty much immediately she is seen on the arm of Edward IV. So yeah, I'm pretty sure her marriage and her relationship with Edward IV had some overlap there. Edward IV is pretty famous for just having like a shitload of mistresses in his life, but he was notorious for the hit it and quit it kind of style. None of them really had staying power. He would like love bomb them and send them jewels and flowers, and like then as soon as he got him in bed, he'd lose interest pretty quick. In fact, like, there aren't a whole lot of mistresses with names in his story. Like, if you Google Edward IV mistresses, Jane Shore is the first thing that comes up. There's also the story about, like, the woman that he supposedly married in secret before he married Elizabeth Woodville in secret. She comes up. I couldn't find a whole lot of other of his supposed, like, throes and throes of mistresses. I couldn't find a whole lot of names. So the fact that we even know Jane Shore's name means that she was, he had feelings for her more than he did for all these other chicks. I did come across one blog post that suggested that he had a sexual relationship with Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, before he married Elizabeth Woodville. And that's on the website historyextra.com. Links to that are in the show notes if you want to read that. That was a story I hadn't heard before, so okay. What made Jane Shore have this longevity? I mean, all I can think of is that he just must have really liked her. Also, I read in several places that he never gave her gifts like he did these other women. As a royal mistress that just kind of quietly lived at court, I mean, he paid for like her housing and probably like her clothes and stuff like that. But it's just a completely different pattern than from his stories of like love bombing and then hitting and quitting it like we got with these other ladies. He didn't give her a lot of gifts. He didn't, and she didn't expect him to either. It just leads me to believe that there was like actually a connection there. She was his mistress from 1467 until his death in 1483. So that's like 7 years. That's not a short affair. Now, don't get me wrong. I 100% believe that Elizabeth Woodville is the love of Edward's life. In fact, they had 3 children. They had 3 more children during that time that after he had taken up with Jane. If Elizabeth Woodville, I just think it's interesting to think about that if Elizabeth Woodville had been born into a more powerful family and like a family that didn't like turn so many people off so much, she would be viewed as like the perfect medieval queen. She played this part perfectly. She never said anything about Edward's affairs. She never publicly spoke about policy or politics. She had babies on babies on babies on babies. She was super charitable and pious in public. And also, Elizabeth Woodville had a lot of power over Edward. He took her advice like to heart whenever they would, talk about things behind the scenes. He consulted her on everything, and he relied on her family for guidance, like a lot. And this just doesn't seem to have changed when Jane Shore hit the scene. So it's just interesting to think of like that comparison with Henry VIII, who famously let the family of whatever woman he was in love with sway his policies and his decision-making. That wasn't Edward's style. Jane was not at all like an official mistress like we think of in France. It wasn't a secret at all that they were together, but she also didn't have like a role in court. She didn't accompany him to any like state dinners. He did not wave it in Elizabeth's face. It wasn't like Henri in France with poor Catherine de Medici and Diane de Poitiers, or with Anne Boleyn, Catherine Aragon situation. But for like 7 years, he'd travel with Elizabeth. He would attend the state dinners and see all the diplomats with Elizabeth by his side. But then after the work was done, and he just went to go have a few drinks and play cards with his buddies, Jane would be there. I just really think he loved both of them. But I also don't think Edward ever made any promises to Jane that there would ever be anything beyond that. And I don't think Jane ever asked for anything beyond that. I think she probably at least really liked him back, maybe even loved him back. She just didn't want to do anything to rock the boat that much. I think she was very happy with how things were going, having some nice clothes, a nice place to live, the fucking king, in your bed. She wasn't trying to grab for power. She just, she was just happy. However, one thing I did find really interesting is that Jane was kind of like a social justice advocate. She'd hear of someone in jail wrongly, or maybe somebody that the king didn't like, and if she didn't think that was fair, or somebody that was just being treated unfairly by law enforcement, and she would use her sway over him to get these people pardoned. She didn't want jewelry. She wanted to help people. I kind of love that. We even have a quote about Jane from Edward that survives to this day. He said, "She's merry in company and ready with a quick answer." So I think she probably just made him laugh, It sounds like she was just fun to have at parties. His friends all liked her too. She just kind of provided this lightheartedness that I think Edward really liked. Because remember, he's like this charismatic guy, and she sounds like this charismatic, easygoing chick. I think they just got along. I wish I knew her sign so I could see what their compatibilities are. What's Edward's sign? Hold up. He's a Taurus. Taurus can be a lot of fun, but they're really hard-headed. I don't know. I guess that is just like a rabbit hole for another time. So, circling back to their story. Jane, well, Elizabeth Woodville most likely knew of Jane. She's not dumb. There's no evidence that she ever did anything to stop the affair. I kind of feel like it's a whole if he's with her, at least I know where he is kind of thing going on. Also, Jane and the king never had any children. So for a time when there was no birth control, and for how long they were together, that surprises me. I also think maybe that was one of the reasons Elizabeth Woodville wasn't really intimidated, because if she had had children, if Jane had had the king's children, she might be a little bit more worried, are those kids going to take place in his heart over my kids? But it just didn't. It wasn't an issue. Edward was probably still picking up chicks on the side because, horn dog's gonna horn dog. But it appears he was still pretty devoted to both of these women. And it doesn't appear that either of them gave him too much grief about the other one. All right, so fast forward a little bit, and Edward dies in 1483. If Jane's birth date of 1445 is right, Jane is about 38. So back then, 38 usually looked a lot older than 38 would look now. So you might think that her looks are starting to fade, but apparently not. Apparently she was still considered pretty much smoking hot. Also, I think one of the reasons that 38 would have looked so much older back then is because, men are going to battle, so that's aging them. Women are having baby after baby after baby, and that's aging them. People lived hard lives where they worked with their hands and did manual labor all day. None of these things apply to Jane Shore at all. So, maybe she just looked really good for 38 back then because she hadn't really lived a hard life up to this point. So, while I'm sure Jane mourned the loss of her lover, she also had to move quick. It doesn't look like he had gifted her any lands or income, which kings often would do that in their will. They would want to make sure that their mistresses were taken care of after their death, and so they would give them a small estate that would have some income or leave them some money or something so they're just not high and dry. But Edward died kind of unexpectedly, and so there's nothing in there for Jane. So she's down and out, and she's like, seriously, what the fuck am I gonna do now? So she had to move on quickly and in close proximity, I guess, because then she hooks up with Thomas Grey, Elizabeth Woodville's, one of her sons from her first marriage. So Edward's stepson. Ew. I mean, I guess since Thomas and Edward weren't blood related, it's not that creepy, but ew, I don't like it. I'm not really sure what happened there, but because then she moves on to William Hastings, who I guess has just been low-key, like, thinking about her since she was a child. Whatever. I'm not sure who she went with first, Grey or Hastings, but, like, how things play out after this, my guess is she was with Grey and then dumped him for Hastings. Or maybe there was some, like, overlap, but in the end was more with Hastings. We'll get to it in a minute. So when Richard III came to power, Hastings, Grey, and all the Woodvilles, and Jane, they were in trouble because he was not interested in any of them having a place at court, having any kind of say, having any kind of power. And Jane did something that I didn't see coming. Hastings decided he needed to befriend Elizabeth Woodville. The two of them had never been friendly, even though they were both major players in Edward IV's life. They had just never gotten along. But now, both of them are really anti-Richard, and so they're like, we need to form an alliance. But Hastings can't just go visit Elizabeth Woodville in sanctuary. I keep almost saying quarantine. No, sanctuary. Like, it would be super suspicious if these two people that never talked when they were both like free agents were now talking while she's in sanctuary. So he sent Jane. He sent Jane to like run the message to Elizabeth Woodville. And Jane's not dumb. She knows what she's doing is dangerous. She knows what she's doing is treason, basically. But she thought it was fucked up what Richard had done, and she's all in. Richard has a very low opinion of Jane Shore because he's a bit of a prude, and she doesn't have a super great opinion about him either because he's kind of a stick in the mud, and you know, he did his brother's legacy wrong. So anyway, she knows what she's doing is bad news, but she's doing it because she believes that Richard is fucked up. So Jane is caught, and Hastings was executed. Thomas Grey, the one that she hooked up with, also was not implicated in this plot at all. So that's why it makes me think that she had completely been done with Thomas Grey. I think it was kind of a short little romance. So Jane was sent to jail. At first, they're floating the idea of accusing her of witchcraft, which must have been very scary for her. This was a time when witches were burnt at the stake. So, my ass would have been so burnt. I just got like a new tarot card deck yesterday. It actually just came in the mail today. It's super cute. If y'all want the link, I love it. I'm like really in love with this deck. So just for saying shit like that, I would have been super duper burnt at the stake. And so I'm sure Jane Shore was horrified at the thought of being charged with witchcraft. But instead, her crime was reduced to harlotry. So Richard III made this big to-do about like Jane Shore showing penance for what she'd done publicly. And she was made to do this walk of shame through the streets of London, basically in her underwear, barefoot. So this is where we're getting to the scene with Cersei, like the Game of Thrones where George R.R. Martin I don't see how anybody could argue that he didn't take his inspiration from this. She isn't naked. Cersei was stripped naked. She's in her slip. They use the phrase curdle in everything I read, but since we don't use that word anymore, I think that basically means like, I mean, it kind of would look like a muumuu, like what your mom or grandma might wear to bed. Maybe you wear a muumuu to bed. I don't know. Like a nightgown, like a slip with sleeves, probably. So we wouldn't consider it all that scandalous now, but back then you may as well have been walking through the streets naked, just in your nightgown. So it would have been, it's meant to be like this huge humiliation for her. It's meant to show the entire city of London, look at this fucking whore. Isn't she disgusting? Isn't she despicable? Tell your children not to be like her. Tell your daughters this is what's gonna wind up happening to you if you sleep with a married man. Tell your sons to stay away from women like this. They're gonna eat your dick. I don't know, like in a bad way though. It was meant to be a walk of shame. Thomas More wrote of her walk that like she held her head up high. She did it with so much dignity that like the people by the end of it were all just kind of like, what? Why is Richard picking on this nice lady? She probably got a few heckles, but again, to compare it to how Cersei's walk in Game of Thrones was, where people were like throwing shit at her and stuff, that just wasn't, that people were just kind of more felt sorry for her, or were even like, look at her holding her head up high, like this is a cool chick. Like it did not end up having the effect that Richard III thought it was going to have. And in fact, you know, this is the time of like chivalry and like damsels in distress. All the men in London were in love with her after this because she is like this damsel in distress being made to pay penance for something that she doesn't deserve by the wicked king. Like it did not go the way Richard wanted it to. This whole thing, like, I just hope it wasn't cold because it gets really drafty in London and it would be really cold just in like a slip. And also walking around barefoot, like the streets of London were not like paved sidewalks. It's gonna be cobblestone that's gonna like hurt your feet. You're probably gonna step on like horse shit and like glass and stones. So I hated that part for her, but she took it on the chin like a fucking trooper. And then she ends her walk of shame and she ends up at the jail in Ludgate. Yeah, like I said, this really backfired and every man that worked in the jail is now in love with Jane Shore. And they're just like, oh, I'll save the beautiful damsel in distress. And so while I'm sure being in jail fucking sucked, it seemed like all the guards and all the men that worked at the jail gave her special attention. So it probably sucked a lot less for her than some other people. One of the guys that fell in love with Jane, hook, line, and sinker, was Richard III's Solicitor General. So like his lawyer, his like top lawyer. And this dude's name was Thomas Lynham. Thomas is like, I'm going to save the damsel in distress and I'm just like so over the moon in love with you, Jane. I'm going to get you out of here and will you marry me? And she was just kind of like, okay. Richard was super against this, but eventually he was just like, whatever, I guess one man's trash is another man's treasure. I guess I'll fucking allow it. He did like write to a bishop and be like, try to talk him out of this. Don't like give him a marriage license or whatever. But anyway, it went forward. Jane and Lynham were married in 1487, and it sounds like the rest of Jane's life was pretty mundane. Her husband was able to go from working high up in the ranks with Richard III to working lower in the ranks for like the Tudors, but he was actively paid to have like a job at court until the end of his life. So that's cool. it doesn't sound like she went to court too much, but she probably just lived, a boring life as an upper middle class wife running their house like she was born into. Some say Jane had a daughter during this marriage. I couldn't find anything concrete about that. I would be surprised because she hadn't had any children up to this point, and I don't think back then you typically got more fertile in your 40s. But I guess crazier things have happened. We know it happened with Catherine Parr having only one child later in life. Though if that daughter was real, like did exist, my guess is she died young because there's nothing else about her. Jane, however, lived into her 80s. Thomas More wrote about her saying that the last part of her life, she was poor and begging on the streets. But a few things I read were like, that doesn't make any fucking sense. We don't think that, Thomas More always wrote credibly, which I tend to believe, because how would she end up poor? Her pretty wealthy dad left her money in his will. And then her wealthy husband would have left her like a home and some money. And we know from her time with Edward, she wasn't like somebody that was like, I gotta buy all the gifts and all the jewelry and all the fancy shit. So I think she would have known how to manage her finances. I don't think she was out gambling and throwing big parties. So I don't buy it. I think she probably lived out the rest of her life just kind of chilling in her house in London, just being boring. I wish that she would have kept a diary or something. I would be so interested to see through her eyes the change of regime, going from living at court and being in love with the king to then going to prison and then seeing the person who antagonized you so much being so disgraced and seeing his legacy just go down the tube and watching the rest of it from afar. Oh, I wish we had something in her words to tell us how she felt about this. But again, we don't. It would be a really fun historical fiction. Maybe it exists. I just haven't read it yet. So anyway, that is the life of Jane Shore and the story of her Cersei-like walk of shame. And I'll see you guys next week. And I love each and every one of you. Cheers, bitches!